everyone. We're glad you can join us here for the very first episode of ShiftED Talks, a podcast by GradRight. This podcast is aimed at reshaping the international higher education landscape. The episodes that you'll hear provide stimulating conversations with leaders all across the education sector, whose ideas challenge, inspire, and celebrate the power and potential of global higher education to shift our world. In this very first episode, we're joined by Dr. Sajay Samuel, an award-winning professor of accounting at the Smeal College of Business at Penn State University. Together, we explore the challenges and promise of full disclosure in higher education, examining how transparency, or lack thereof, affects international students, universities, and the broader higher ed ecosystem. From navigating financial hurdles to unpacking institutional processes, Dr. Samuel's insights shed light on how clarity can transform higher education for the better. Listen on for a thought-provoking conversation, and thanks for listening. Hi everyone, today we're meeting Professor Sajay Samuel, an award-winning professor of accounting at the Smeal College of Business at Penn State University. Hi, Professor Samuel. It's nice to have you here.
Hi, Alana. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. So before we dive into the harder topics, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about your own student and career journey?
Right. I came 35 years ago. That's a long time, a generation ago. Some of the students from India, for instance, who are applying now were not even born. I came around late 1980s. And the higher education landscape was remarkably different. For instance, I know I applied to two places. One was LSE, the London School of Economics in the UK, and Penn State, because it had the same kind of background and kind of research and accounting that I wanted to do. But only Penn State offered teaching assistantship. So that's how I end up here. The point being that most graduate programs, including the MBA program, in those days were more or less entirely funded. That means you came in, you did your classwork, and then you did teaching assistant hours. And so you helped a professor teach, grade, etc. And that more or less paid your bills. At least your tuition was waived, and then you had a substantial amount towards your living expenses, which is no longer true, or not as true as it used to be. And so that's a significant difference 40 years on. Speaking of the climate and the context of higher education in the US. And the second thing I think germane to students from abroad is, unlike when I came here, now the domestic enrollments are declining. And that for a variety of reasons, but that just puts a lot of pressure on the university, higher education in the US, to get international students. So there's a pull as well from here, which perhaps 20, 30 years ago was not true.
That's right.
Students came because they wanted to, but there was no explicit going out and marketing for students back in India or in China or in Africa and so on. So
Can you
go on.
Can you share with us a bit about your personal history? Where in India are you from? We know you're from India.
I grew up
at what? No, continue, please. So I'm curious as to where you're from. Where you, I believe you did your bachelor's degree in India, and then you moved to the U.S. So of course, at GradRight, we are working with, now hundreds of thousands of international students, or soon to be. So I'd love to hear a bit of your own, just some details of your own journey there.
Right. I was a kind of a nerdy kid and growing up in Bombay, Mumbai now, of course, but Bombay. And I went to Sydenham College. And before that, I went to a boarding school in Gujarat called Rajkumar College. So I had a somewhat different formation academically and intellectually. And I realized very early on that at the time, at least, and I think that might be still true, though not as much, academics does not allow you to live in the 1980s. If you wanted to make a life as an academic, you couldn't. So one had to come abroad. That was the one thing. And to the question of, I did get an undergraduate degree in economics and commerce, and finance. And actually, I also did a master's there in banking. I couldn't, more than a checkbook today, I have no idea what's going on in the world of banking. And then I came here ostensibly for a master's degree, but that was a sort of a little bit of a thing with my father, who wanted me to come here, do an MBA and go back. And I took the opportunity to come here and stick around for a PhD and never go back. And in that sense, a few of the students I bump into are in surprisingly a similar boat. They seem to be wanting to get away, though arguably the economic situation in India now is nothing like it was 40 years ago. There are far more opportunities than one would imagine. The same pressure to, even in the world of academics, I know of professors who can, who can make a very decent living as a university faculty member. So things have changed, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, with the globalization of industry and so many other things, graduates now also have opportunities to even start somewhere in the U.S. and be transferred to India or vice versa.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's that movement there.
I think that point needs to be, and I hope it'll come up in our conversation later, that a lot more needs to be done to make that possibility more, people more aware of that possibility, and not just students.
Now, you've already mentioned, the issue of,
yes,
it seems a good leeway into a discussion on transparency. And of course, GradRight, we have an event coming up called ShiftED in the first week of December. And the theme, as you know, of the conference is catalyzing growth in higher education, trust, transparency, and accountability. And what that means for us really is to sort of lay it all out on the table within the sector. Your take on this, on transparency in higher education.
That's a very good question, because, and I know GradRight is now embarking on this project to create an index on transparency. So, as I said earlier, I'm a bit of a nerdy guy, so one wants to understand what the word means before one presumes to know what it refers to. And it is clearly a visual metaphor, transparency. I'm sitting in front of a glass window through which I can look, and that's the definition of transparency. So you can see something that is otherwise not visible to you, and you see it as it is. Transparency, the medium itself does not distort, deflect. You see the thing for what it is. In contrast to a camera, for instance, though we're with a camera, typically the understanding of a camera, it's one way. You're the object of, let's say, surveillance or being seen, the cameras in the streets and so on, which reveals a little bit about this push for transparency over the last 15 years or so. It's been a relatively new thing, though it has resonances reaching further back. The explicit call for transparency in government, in corporations, among institutions, even in the classroom. This language of transparency has taken on a certain visibility in and of itself. It's become more popular. And it seems to me, it discloses the fact that as opposed to being seen, those who are being seen now want to see who's looking. I'm coming to an institution. Where am I going? What is this institution about? The government is running a program. What are they doing? Right? It's ordinary people, recipients, who are now reversing the eyesight, line of sight. I want to see what you're doing. So very quickly in the classroom, for example, and this more or less goes to the bookends of my time here. when I first came here, SRT, student evaluations, were just coming on. And student evaluations is a way to make transparent, if you want, make visible what the professor is doing in the classroom. Rankings of university programs and universities themselves were just beginning to take off. The US News and World Report, if I'm not mistaken, is a mid to late 1980s phenomenon.
Where 1980, I believe. Yeah.
Something like that, right? So what are these ranking and ratings about? It's to try and give visibility to the consumer, to the recipient, of what the institution is about. It's number one in this. It's very good in engineering. This is the experience. Making more transparent, making more visible. So it seems to me the push to transparency is to reverse those who were first being seen are now trying to see. And the default mode in which institutions are made visible, whether government, corporate, nor NGOs, is numerical ranking kind of data. That seems to be the default, right? It's not like we have a camera sitting in front of me watching what I'm doing in the classroom. You need a ranking. Rate my professor, for example.
Right.
That's right. Students come to my class on the elective class, and they've all checked out Rate My Professor before they walk in.
Although, to the credit of a system like Rate My Professor, these ratings are entirely determined by the students themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, although it has its issues, of course, but it seems to be something that's definitely lacking in the sector, is the student involvement in the rankings, for instance.
A certain skepticism with respect to the medium. It pretends to be a glass through which you can see the institution, but in fact, the way the sausage is made discloses a lot about what you're seeing.
That's right.
So students or potential students have to be a little more skeptical when they come across a ranking, for instance. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So tell me, can we discuss another example, let's say? So we've talked a bit about the issue of transparency when it comes to ranking. What about something like ROI, return on investment in education?
Right. So I think this is a very pregnant sort of question. When I'd given a talk many years ago, it got picked up and became quite popular, and I had argued there that students need a lot more information on the outcomes of their educational choices. And so one common way to capture the three different players in the game. You have the Penn State or any academic institution providing a service. You have the student buying the service, and you have a lender, for example, making that transaction possible. Now, each one of them, just limiting oneself to the financial economic facets of that relationship, not going into the psychological welfare and so on, just the financial stuff. As far as the university is concerned, it costs a certain amount to educate, to provide this service. And their ROI, return on investment, for example, is the tuition that they receive divided by the expenses that they incur, the investment that they've made. And that margin is what defines whether or not they're providing a profitable service. Now, to be fair, not all institutions are profit-seeking, as they should not be. But having said that, they're not insensitive. They're not providing a service at a loss. So as far as the institution is concerned, even if it is notionally a not-for-profit, it wants to make sure that it at least covers its cost and then has some.
That's right.
So the tuition divided by the total investment it's making, whether in terms of a share of the classrooms, the faculty, the equipment, and so on, is the ROI for the institution. And of course, the increase of ROI, more or less, is by increasing tuition. But that is precisely the expense on the side of the student.
That's right.
The student's ROI, his investment or her investment, is the amount paid as tuition. plus incidentals, living costs, food, etc. And the return on that is the delta, the difference he or she will make with the job.
Right.
Before education, they earned $100. Now they earn 125. The 25 is the difference that the education makes. 25 divided by the investment is the ROI for the student. But notice the interaction there. The tuition going up improves the ROI of the institution, decreases the ROI of the student. So they're working a little bit at cross purposes.
That's right.
And as far as the lender is concerned, the lender lends out the money to the student, and the student is really a pass-through, keeps nothing, it just goes to the institution. So in fact, the lender is giving the money to the institution, and the student has to pay that back through the increased wages. So the risk the lender takes is that the 25 delta that we spoke about, 100 to 125, the additional income actually comes through. Now, unless you have a very good understanding of the market risk, speaking purely as a financial matter, right? The lender gives the dollars expecting a return, but that depends on whether the student gets the job with the delta 25.
That's right.
And it's not at all clear that lenders sitting abroad might have the same visibility that lenders do here. And even so, as we're discovering with the case of US student debt, even if you're in the US, it's not clear that you have enough visibility to make discriminating loan decisions. So the ROI for that for the institution and that for the student become the common language and currency by which a conversation can be had. Right? Things become clearer, more, to use an overused word, perhaps transparent, if the three ROIs can be discussed. Hey, is the institution making 10% when the student is only making 3%? We could have a conversation then to readjust things. Is the lender making 22% when the student is making 2%? We could have a conversation. But ROI might provide that common metric, understanding full well that each ROI has its own calculations and might be running at cross purposes.
I want to thank you for this explanation, because actually I have yet to consider how each stakeholder in the sector can take a common concept and and find a way to create that symmetry in order to come to a central definition of something. I know, for instance, also from the work we do with students, that when a student and many parents look to ROI, it really is solely about that job, and they look at the tuition, not to mention all of the costs associated, the employment outcomes of a particular institution. And there's that attempt to understand, if this investment is going to be worth it down the line. Now, that information that they're receiving in terms of job outcomes, opportunities, this is very difficult to nail down accurately.
Exactly.
So we have another gap in the information.
You couldn't be more right. And in fact, this leads one to ask, what is the cost to the student of this lack of transparency, this lack of knowledge? So, the transparency is, I know, information asymmetry. You know something I don't know. These are twin concepts. The student and a measure of that, because I've been interested in what GradRight does. And I'm the faculty director of the MBA program here, incidentally. So I come across a lot of international students whose numbers, from an institutional standpoint, international students are vital to our mission for the reasons I just said. We have declining domestic enrollment. And so I'm in conversation with them. And one of the things that come up is expectations gap. There's a gap in what the student expects to get versus what is feasible here. The feasible solution set here is remarkably compared to what the student expects. And this expectation gap is caused by the information asymmetry. The student does not know things that we know here. And at one level, you think, in this age of information where it's flowing so easily, everything should be transparent. But it's not. Here's the example. I bumped into a handful of masters of computer science kids, all from India. They're large enough to constitute a significant minority of the graduating class. Masters in computer science. Their salary expectation and the logic. First, I'll tell you the logic. The logic is Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, is earning $50 million. I throw out a number. Therefore, I, as a starting computer scientist with 5 or 6 years of experience in India, would start at $500,000.
That's right.
Reality check. Come on now, right?
Yes.
So expectation gap built out of information asymmetry. A lot of work seems to be necessary. So what are the ill effects of this lack of transparency or understanding or information asymmetry? Others are trying to find a job here, grinding it out with a lot of psychological stress for 2, 3, 4, 6 months before they can land something that is halfway reasonable. Now, it is not to say that this is either a large number or the average experience. Actually, I don't know because we don't have the data. We don't know how many international students succeed, how many fail, how many are in a difficult place. At least globally, we don't. We can push individual institutions to try and track these outcomes. But globally, what you're trying to do with that index is very timely and very important.
Yeah, I hope that I hope it comes to fruition in the right way. And we have you as one of our key advisors on the project. So that's very, very exciting for us. You're obviously, from this conversation, just the right person to be guiding us there.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, let's hope. Yeah.
In your talking about student
many years
over
ago,
a
it's an
million
old
views.
One, but
yes. Can you just in a couple of lines, sum up your arguments there?
Right. So I take a rather. Sometimes it's important to see things in a darker light rather than wrap it up or see it through rose-tinted glasses. Student debt in America is going up. It's so big, it's so large that it becomes a subject of political discussion, right? And it becomes a platform issue for the Democrats versus the Republicans and so on in the US. It's a big thing. $1.7 trillion of student debt. And the argument of the talk was, look, unless we get better information, unless students have clearer information on how this program pays off in terms of lifetime earnings, they'll just jump into something going on the general perception that college is good and college pays off, without really digging into the numbers, without actually doing an ROI. And the reason why they're in debt and unpayable debt is precisely because the ROIs don't work out. So could it be that universities produce better information, and then students use/search for better information in order to make more discriminating decisions to avoid the debt problem? Now, what I'm beginning to sniff, and this is the additional reason why I'm so fond of is the wrong word, but I'm so supportive of what GradRight is doing, is that I fear this lack of information, this information asymmetry, combined with the expectation gap. They're expecting great things when they come to the US, for the want of knowing better, will export the student debt problem from the US to India. So that if you have a bunch of young men and women coming here for a better opportunity, as they should, but it's based on erroneous information, are they going to be consigned to a student debt problem like Americans are facing, right? And it is to that, both moral, to my mind, both financial but also moral question, that something like this GradRight effort, which is not only to put together the players in a more sensible way, but also to, for instance, develop an index that that becomes useful to students when they're making decisions. Now, the optimism of youth cannot be counted on to be rational. So, index or no index, samples, swim, fly, and float to shores abroad. But you can only do what you can do.
Absolutely. Thank you. And when you talk about, just you said very sort of lightly what universities should be doing or can be doing and what students can and should be doing. I just want to point out that at GradRight, we've conducted a few interviews lately as part of the Transparency Index project. And students are seemingly prospective graduate students, let's say from India. The majority of them don't seem to be concerned with the very issue of transparency. And there's a direct question as part of one of our surveys. How important is transparency of information and accuracy of information delivered by universities to your decision-making process? And we had a majority response of somewhat important and not important. Now, it really put a new light for us on the topic because, of course, what we're doing is we're supporting students by trying to access the accurate information for them to make the right decisions for their futures based on their financial needs, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly I realized that
they don't care.
Well, here's the so it's a question. I'm not convinced that they don't care. I'm convinced that the wool is still pulled over many people's eyes. That it is still difficult to imagine that the information that they're receiving is not accurate, or is not necessarily evaluatable whatever the word is. So rankings, for instance, it's a similar story. It's taking what's given as gold, and
as God's truth. Implied in your question/comment, I think are three elements that I'd like to separate out. One is, what can universities do better in terms of providing information? And I'll anchor myself on two data points so that your listeners can understand the degree of information asymmetry. Currently in my classes, there are Indian students who tell me, we didn't know that the textbooks would cost X. And when we take a loan from a lender, they pay the tuition, they pay the living expenses, but not anything that is not mentioned. And one of the things not mentioned was the textbooks. We here take it for granted, $50, $100, $200 sometimes. But you add it all up, and that's a substantial quantity that should have been built into the loan portfolio, but it is not. Similarly, for instance, there could be one-off events, a global immersion trip, the specifications of which, the details of which financially are left for a later time. So that becomes then a sudden burden on the personal savings of the student. It's not built into the loan. So what can universities do a bit better? One could separate out the information, kind of information, into two types. One is financial, and the second thing is process. Financial, what does it cost all in? And on the flip end, when I get out, what's the likelihood of, with this degree, what kind of job do I get? Don't tell me don't dream it's $500,000. No. Can we can we calibrate it to something sensible? You're going to start at this kind of position, and this kind of position in the US earns so and so on average. And this data is generally available. It's a matter of putting it
And for
together.
how long? And for how long? Are you starting with an internship, which means that
Ex-
the salary that's presented may only be happening after 3 years or so. So
That's right. So
yeah.
universities can be a little more frank and open and clear about the cost and the salary or the reward, if you want, the incomes, likely incomes. Student outcomes are so varied and out of the control of the institution. Naturally, we'll find it difficult to say you're likely to earn X, but we could give you a range based on experience and probabilities and so on. So that's one thing. The other part of the information set that feeds into this asymmetric information, what the students don't know, is the underlying, is the process that what happens in the educational settings in the US is quite different from what happens in India. The expectations of the classroom are different. And typically now master's programs about a year, 18 months, you're getting thrown into the ocean, into the sea, full on, and unless you're really prepared and you have some experience, you find yourself at sea. For instance, international students, I don't want to characterize with a broad brush, more reticent to talk, to ask, to inquire, to work with teams. They're used to a certain way of being, and that way of being is not the way of being here. So understanding the process a little better, you're expected to work in teams. You're expected to speak up. There's a lot of individual work. You have to take the initiative. Nobody's going to spoon feed you. It's not a Q&A like in India. When I was growing up, we had to do, at the end of 3 years, I must have done 8,000 problems of accounting. You go more seamlessly through the process, right? So in terms of information that institutions can do, this was the first part. Financial information, what does it cost and what are the likely outcomes? And second, what does that process look like?
Yeah.
Is it the case that I'm sitting in a classroom from 8 o'clock till 2 o'clock, then quick have a light lunch, and then work with teams until 6 o'clock, and then prepare the rest of the evening for my class next day? Whoa, I didn't realize that. That didn't sink in. So two things. The other part, a lot of information of a qualitative nature, not what you see on an index by a number, but of a qualitative nature, resides in the heads of the experience of students, right, who have graduated. Is there a way to create a network of that so that, and it's a matter of paying it forward kind of thing, right? The student who just graduated is taking care of the one who's coming behind him or her. And it's in that spirit that the information is shared. But I know students who are 1 year out, 1.5 year out, in different stages. Some, one or two are very successful. That's a story worth telling and should be told. There are others who had to go back. There are yet others who are still grinding it out in Chicago, who are living on the sofa of a friend, trying to make ends meet and trying to figure out what comes down the pipe. So a richer vein of stories that allows the prospective student in India not just to look at the ranking of what the institution is giving, but also getting this other kind of qualitative information. And the third element, so one is institutional information. The second is alternative sources, particularly from recent grads and so on. But then the third is, I think, and maybe this is also where GradRight can help when it develops its index. The metaphor of the looking glass or the glass in front suggests that the glass has no distortive properties.
That's right.
And therefore you can just trust the number. But we have to build a lot of skepticism among the consumers of these things, right? So I think coming up with indices are very good, but it comes with the warning that this is one bit of information in a larger information set. The student has to put himself out, not allow optimism to run the
Right.
table. It's good to be optimistic, of course, but it can't be blind. Right.
And we need those inputs. We're always looking for
Exactly.
those inputs.
So for instance, I would imagine a lender's decision will be much more refined and correct if they heard stories about visa difficulties, salary difficulties. Profile is quite different from somebody who's
Of
alone.
course.
Uh, so,
Hmm.
but that you glean through stories, not just looking at the salary earned. Right? That's not enough. So, is there a way to allow that rich information vein, not only to help students, but to refine the lending market? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it sounds like we have quite a lot of work to do. um,
I can't think of anybody better to do it than GradRight. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. And thank you for advising us and staying by us and
Yes,
having
yes.
all of your faith in us.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. And I really appreciate you being here and joining us today. And as always, hearing your thoughts is very exciting, very informative.